We're really delighted to hear from three scholars at BYU today. Julie Allen in the Department of Comparative Arts and Letters, Becca Driggs, who is a Kennedy Center Student Research Fellow in History, and Sarah Reed, who's also a professor in the History Department. Collectively, they will be speaking on LDS women converts' journeys from Scandinavia. I will introduce each of their presentations in turn. They will speak for a short period of time, and then we will invite them to come up here and have a panel discussion, Q&A, toward the end of our time. Well, we will go until 1 p.m. today. And I'd like to start by introducing Professor Julie Allen. She is Professor of Scandinavian Studies and Comparative Literature in the Department of Comparative Arts and Letters here at BYU. Her 2017 book, Danish but Not Lutheran, looks at the question of how Danes reacted to the large-scale conversion of their neighbors to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. So we'll start with Julie. Coming up.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a topic that I have been working on for a long time. It wasn't until I served a mission to Denmark that I was really aware of how many Danes had joined the church and immigrated, and I also wasn't aware until halfway through my mission that one of them was my great-great-grandmother. So I'll come back to her in a minute, but I ended up getting a PhD in German with Danish as a minor and started teaching classes on Scandinavian immigration, and discovered, if you look at maps of Americans of Scandinavian descent, that obviously the Midwest has strong congregations particularly of Norwegians, on the top left, and Swedes on the top right. But if you look at the bottom left map, you see that the one place that has a really strong congregation of or concentration of Danes is Utah. And so we have actually the claim to almost the largest percentage of the population with Danish ancestry. And so as I was working on my Scandinavian immigration classes and started working on a book that came out in 2017, Danish but Not Lutheran, I started discovering the scope of this phenomenon, which you might all have at your fingertips, but just for review, between 1850 and 1905, about 23,500 Danes converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. From a population of 1 million Danes at the time, that was a pretty significant percentage of the population. It was also unheard of because until 1849, you could not join another religious group and retain your citizenship in Denmark. So they get religious freedom in 1849, and about a month later, the missionaries show up and start converting people, largely Baptists who had been thrown in jail for converting to the Baptist church, and then many other people. Of that group of 23,500, about 12,700 immigrated to Utah. Taking a step back, if you look at Scandinavia as a region, about 45,524 people converted between 1850 and 1900. And of that, about 28,858 immigrated in organized companies. So you see an attrition rate of about 32% from the converts to the immigrants, but those who stayed in the church almost exclusively immigrated. Once they got to Utah, they became the second largest immigrant group in the state after Brits. And so they made up about 8% of the population in the 1880s. 57% of those Scandinavian immigrants were Danes, 32% were Swedish, about 10% were Norwegian, and there was a fraction that was Icelandic. And there's a slightly higher percentage of women than men. So if you look in the 1950 improvement era, John A. Widtsoe, who we'll hear about a little later, estimated what percentage of which counties had Scandinavian ancestry. And so you see St. Pete and Sevier lead with 78%, Box Elder with 64.8%, Cache with 52.9%, Utah County was 50% Scandinavian in 1950, Salt Lake County 45%, Weber County 36.7%, and the average across all these 681 wards and branches was 44.8% of the population had Danish or Scandinavian ancestry, which suggests this is something we should care about. You see, if you look at the map of Utah and how Scandinavians settled, you start to discover that there were areas that were heavily Scandinavian, as we just saw, but they were also kind of everywhere. And so these little graphs on the left, the white part is Scandinavian. And so you can see the parts where they were really, really strong and particularly San Pete and Sevier, as we heard, but also kind of down the whole central corridor of the state. So as I started looking into this, so my book ends with a chapter on Scandinavian immigrants coming to Utah. So what it was like getting religious freedom, what it was like converting, what it was like having their neighbors mock them for polygamy and white slave trafficking. But I discovered that most of what's written about the Scandinavians in Utah is about the men, which isn't surprising. They had more prominent positions. They went back as missionaries. Susan Easton Black's terrific book, Legacy of Sacrifice, talks about the missionaries that go back to Scandinavia. Andrew Jensen, himself a Danish immigrant, wrote an LDS biographical encyclopedia that talks a lot about the Scandinavians. Some of these names on this list on the left are probably familiar to you. They do get a little bit jumbled together. There's a joke that Richard Jensen tells in his Friendly Invasion article. In church one Sunday, the bishop, after clearing his throat, said, "Brother Peterson, will you please offer the benediction?" All of them in the congregation, but one, stood up. "I meant Brother Peter Peterson," the bishop amended. One man sat down. So it can be hard to keep track of all these Scandinavians. They do have, patronymic names that resemble each other a lot. Some of them are a little better known. Anton Lund became an apostle, as did John Andreas Widtsoe. Frederick Ferdinand Samuelson was the second member of the church to be a member of a national parliament. After Reed Smoot, he was in the Danish parliament and then immigrated to Utah for the last decade of his life. Torleif Knaphus was a famous Norwegian sculptor who has done a lot of work that we've seen. Gutzon Borglum was also the child of Danish Mormon converts who then left the church, and then he carved Mount Rushmore. So we can't really quite claim him, but we can pretend. But when you look for the women, they're hard to find. That they were busy doing the things that women do, having children, keeping their families alive, making dinner every single night, all the things that were involved in pioneer life, as well as pursuing many other goals. And so I was really fortunate to get funding this year to establish a research group to investigate the lives of Scandinavian Mormon women converts. And we have this website that is not yet very developed. We are building a database, but we've been going through the census records from 1850 to 1920 and keeping track of all the Scandinavian women and their daughters and trying to find out who they were, what their stories were. So Becca is one of my research assistants and will talk about what she's been discovering. A couple more of them are here in the audience. And it's been really fascinating to find the range of experiences that they had and the diversity of their experiences in Utah. So I will talk a little bit about a few women in Pleasant Grove, but to keep an eye out for this website, ScandinavianLDSwomen.byu.edu. We're hoping to have that populated over the next year as a public-facing website where you can look up the women in the different counties and towns in Utah and see the connections between them and get a sense of what work there still is to be done on the stories of their lives. So I mentioned my Danish great-great-grandmother. Her name is Karen Christina Hermansdatter Beck. Sometimes transliterated as Carolina Chestina Knight. So she didn't play a big part in our family stories, partly because she died at the age of 39 of tuberculosis. And she lived in Santa Clara. And when I found out about her, I was so curious to know more about her experiences joining the church on the island of Bornholm, immigrating with her brother, who went to Paris, Idaho, meeting Samuel Knight at a church farm in Salt Lake, going to Santa Clara with him, getting a wagon box full of orphans after the Mountain Meadow Massacre delivered to her front door, having 6 daughters, and then leaving them in death very young. I have never gotten to find out much more about her. There's a story told about her in the WPA histories, but I was given a surrogate great-grandmother in Wilhelmina Marie Jacobsen Bolvi Jørgensen. Her family called her Minnie Jacobsen. And she is a few decades younger than my great-grandmother, but had a similar life story of coming to Utah, joining the church, coming to Utah, settling here, and struggling with some of the conditions of pioneer life. I was invited to translate her letters to her husband. He served a mission from 1881 to 1883, and their family was never able to read her letters. And so I got to translate their entire correspondence, which I'm in the process of publishing with the Religious Studies Center, which tells a fascinating story of what life was like from the inside of a pioneer woman's, Danish pioneer woman's life. Oh, sorry, in the middle there, if you look at that, the book Mormon Women's History Beyond Biography, there is an article about Minnie Jacobsen there. But to take a step back from Minnie, She lived in Pleasant Grove, which doesn't usually appear as one of the big Scandinavian towns. Everyone knows about Ephraim and everyone knows about the little Denmarks scattered around. But Pleasant Grove was actually a pretty heavily Scandinavian town, one of the most Scandinavian towns south of Salt Lake in this period. It was originally founded in 1855, incorporated in 1855, founded in 1850, called Battle Creek because of the war, then renamed Pleasant Grove. And the first Scandinavians to settle there come in 1858. And those Scandinavians had come to Utah in 1852, settled in Salt Lake, and then were deciding to make their way down to join other Scandinavians in St. Pete, but decided to stay in Pleasant Grove instead. So you have a Dane, Ivar Nicholas, his Canadian wife, their children, the Peterson family, not Peter, Rasmus Peterson, his Swedish wife, Ingeline, and their daughter Stine, and all of them end up settling in Pleasant Grove and attracting more families. We'll talk a little bit about chain migration in a second. By the 1870 census, there are 35 Scandinavian families in Pleasant Grove. By the 1880 census, there's 110 Scandinavian families, and the census shows that the town is pretty evenly divided between Scandinavian-born immigrants, British-born immigrants, and then their American-born children. So what we see is, first of all, that because some Scandinavians settled there and liked it, they got other Scandinavians to settle there. This was really handy on the way from Salt Lake. If you were heading down to St. Pete and got tired, you could just stop in Pleasant Grove. Paul Anderson, sorry, I said that in a very Danish way, the Swedish settler, he had been living in a dugout there in 1866 and kind of had a lookout for settlers coming by. The Warnick family had just come from southern Sweden, a 6-month journey, which had cost them dearly. Most of the family had died of cholera. So only 4 of the family members had made it all the way to Utah. And they were making their way down to the Scandinavian settlements. And Paul Anderson comes out of his dugout and says, "Hey guys, hang out with me. Have some dinner by my fire." And Charlie Warnick recalled later, "The next day we traveled beyond American Fork and camped the night near Pleasant Grove. There were Scandinavian people who had settled there. That evening, some of them came down to our camp to see if there might be any of their friends or relatives among the immigrants. One of these was a man called Paul Anderson, who had just recently built himself a small one-room house that was partly in the ground. When he saw the condition that my sister-in-law was in because of both sickness and sorrow, he invited us to stop in Pleasant Grove and stay with them until we could find some place to be by ourselves. We had no definite place to locate in St. Pete, and it was still 3 days' travel, and Brother Anderson's offer was just too good to turn down. So we gathered our belongings and went with him. His family was kind and hospitable, and they were ever after among our dearest friends." And the Warnick family goes on to attract more of their relatives and really become a very prominent family in the area and a sort of a cornerstone of the Scandinavian community there. That community was very vibrant. Charlie Warnick founded a Scandinavian organization in 1882, and they had a great time. They hosted sleigh rides. They had visits from Lussagubben. If you read the second note there, a man dressed in a warm coat, hat, boots, and gloves who carried a coal oil lantern and a tray of small cheese sandwiches, sugar cookies, and wine. And he came in chanting in a deep voice, "Lussanatten, svenska lasse, har du några stygga barn?" And he meant, "Listen tonight, my good people, have you any mean children?" And so, if you were not mean, you got treats, cheese sandwiches, and he carried a gunny sack on his back with the legs of a boy sticking out. So the intimidation of children was alive and well in that period as a festive holiday activity. So Lussagubben came on December 12th. They'd hold midsummer celebrations and annual Christmas Day programs from 1876 to 1916. They had Scandinavian choirs, they had theatrical productions, grand Scandinavian balls, they served Danish coffee and buns, and even went to their own Scandinavian wards. One was established in 1858, and then it was divided into 3 districts later. But it wasn't all fun and games, and there was pressure to assimilate, to speak English. Intermarriage was encouraged, but not always practical. Children were often mocked for their Scandinavian accents, for their Scandinavian parentage, and so there's some tensions there. And I'm out of time, so I'm just going to say the project we're doing is trying to illuminate some of these aspects to help us understand better these lives. Mina Jacobson, that I talked about here, she ended up writing a lot of letters to her husband, as I mentioned. A lot of them were about Andrew Jensen's wife, Marie. And it's really fascinating to read the way that these communities function, both in solidarity and in competition, and in the ways that they did create a home that was both part of Zion, but also separate from it. And so we'll hear a little bit more about these from the next couple of speakers.
Thank you very much, Professor Allen. Our next speaker is a BYU student, Becca Driggs. Becca is pursuing a BA in history with a minor in global women's studies. Her research focuses on suffrage, polygamy, and the religious lives of ordinary late 20th century Utah women. And she will be speaking on the topic From Fjords to Fields, the Journeys of Early Swedish Mormon Settlers.
After 15 minutes on the I-15, I get off on Orem exit 273. From there, I continue straight for 1.2 miles, past the Del Taco on my left, and reach my destination. This lot. Right across the street from Quick Quack. Cars buzzed past as I stared. 411 West, 1600 North, Orem, Utah, 84507. According to a biography written by her daughter, this was the burial place of Ava Carlotta's 2 sons while born on the polygamist underground. It's strange that such a grave site is now next to a car wash. For the past 11 months, I've been researching and reviewing the lives and cultures of Scandinavian women who immigrated to the United States from 1860 to 1920, which Julie talked about. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be talking predominantly about Swedish women. According to the Utah History Encyclopedia, by 1910, 17,063 of Utah's residents were either Swedish immigrants or their descendants, which comprised 4.2% of the population and ranked Utah 5th out of all of the states for Swedish population, which we saw earlier in those maps. So what were their lives like, both in Sweden and Utah, and the immigration in between? Why did they come? Why did they stay? And more importantly, why should we even care? To answer these questions, I'm going to focus on 2 women. The first is Ava Carlotta Anderson, who I mentioned a little earlier, and the second is Annie Dorothy Erickson. So Ava Carlotta was born in 1853 in Nyköping, Sweden, to a poor working-class family. Her oldest brother left for the military when she was young, leaving her and her older sister responsible for caring for their family. They vowed to each other to never marry nor have children because they were certain this was the surest way to stay in poverty. The family wasn't religious, but she would sing Lutheran songs with her friend Christine Pearson. In the winter of 1881, Ava was walking home when she overheard Mormon preachers. She was intrigued by their words and began attending church. It's unclear whether her family supported her in this decision, but they didn't join her in baptism. And when she was offered by the Perpetual Immigration Fund the opportunity to immigrate to Utah, she undertook the adventure alone. Though 44% of Swedish converts immigrated to Utah, she describes the members of the congregation feeling sorry to think that she was going to Utah. The diary that she kept throughout her journey remarks her marvels at America. America is a wonderful land, high forests, deep valleys, very pretty. And if all people in Sweden had this big open country, they would be rich. And at her arrival in Utah, she said of Ogden, no one can imagine this land before they see it. It's all so surprising. Ava settled in Grantsville outside of Tooele, Utah, where 30% of the residents were from Sweden. There she became the second wife of prominent townsman William Bjork, had 2 children, and was forced on the Mormon underground. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act to counter the barbarism and spread of Mormon polygamy. This act disincorporated the church and fined polygamous men over $500 or 5 years in prison if caught. To protect their husbands, many women went into hiding, some even relocating or changing their names. Though Ava doesn't report changing her name, she does record her children knowing to hide whenever people came around, because children equals marriage, and according to the law, Ava was no longer legally married. During her time on the underground, she relocated to Orem, then called Provo Bench, and gave birth to 2 sons as infants, which brings us back to the slot from earlier, where they were reportedly buried. Ava was compelled to bury them at night to evade the authorities. Even though Provo Cemetery was built in 1853, Ava would not have had means to access burial plots at night, leading to her burying her children in the front yard. What kind of comfort can a mother receive when her children are memorialized at night in hiding? Would she visit the sites in her yard during the day and place flowers? Were her neighbors there to comfort her? Though this is now an empty lot, were the bodies ever relocated to a proper cemetery? Ava would never see her family from Sweden again. However, her friend Christine Pearson did immigrate to Utah, and their descendants recorded they would often sing together at church and public gatherings, just as they did in their childhood days in Sweden. 150 miles away from where Ava spent her childhood days, Annie Dorothy Erickson was born on February 6, 1857, in Hemsö, Sweden. Her family had lost an infant son to pneumonia while traveling in the middle of winter to the nearest Lutheran church for his baptism. Her father spent the next years questioning infant baptism and rejoiced when he heard missionaries speak of the innocence of little children. Unlike Ava, who joined the church and immigrated alone, Annie Dorothy was baptized in the LDS church alongside her family. The whole family immigrated the next year in 1864. They spent all they had on immigration, leaving them with only one pair of shoes for her and her older sister Joanna to share, who's pictured in the far. Is that right? Sure. Their parents valued education, and so the two girls would take turns wearing the single pair of shoes to school while the others stayed home and cared for the family and helped around the house. From her husband's autobiography, we learn that Charles G. Stromberg fell in love with a young lady, 19 years of age, with long black curls, Annie Dorothy Erickson. And of him, Annie said, "Charlie would never argue with me and could never stay mad very long with anyone." He was a prominent businessman. They married and had 6 children, but 2 died as infants. On October 29, 1884, he received a call to the Swedish mission, sold what he could, tied $400 in a little bag in his underclothing, and left Annie alone with a herd of cows and loving neighbors for support. Despite his efforts, the family struggled financially over the next 2 years, and Annie sold all they had, including her wedding ring. That winter, though, the children caught a serious case of diphtheria, and all 4 of her surviving children died throughout the March of 1886. 3 of the 4 are in this picture, 2 of her sons being buried in the same casket. The neighbors feared catching the disease, but Emmy Anderson, one of her Swedish neighbors, helped Annie clean the children's shoes and place them in a neat row, put a shawl over Annie's shoulders, and lead her out the door. Emmy gave Annie a warm cup of coffee and sent for Aunt Mary Ann Anderson, whose natural humor helped heal Annie's broken heart. Clearly, this was a tight-knit community of Swedish immigrants, that they would bond over coffee, mourning, and of course, Aunt Mary Ann's humor to heal their broken hearts. I found the mention of coffee incredibly interesting, especially considering these are Mormon women. And upon research, I learned that coffee drinking was very popular in Utah and among Swedes. After the discontinuation of polygamy, the word of wisdom became emphasized, contrary to the norms of the time. Evidently, Annie drank coffee, and in Ava's immigration journal, she detailed how excited she was to stay in a hotel for the first time, because there we can cook all the coffee we want to. Additionally, cases of diphtheria were strikingly prevalent throughout the whole United States, with it counting for over a quarter of all deaths among children ages 5 to 15, according to the 1880 census. The second cause of death, respiratory disease, counted for a mere 16%. As such, neither of Annie's experiences with diphtheria nor coffee drinking were particularly unique, though most families didn't deal with the loss of all of their children alone while their husband was across the seas on a mission. From this dramatic loss, Annie fell into a deep depression. Her husband was requested to come early from his mission. He reports that upon arrival, mother, Annie, never cried or smiled, just stared. So it was a depressing homecoming. President Joseph F. Smith, then patriarch of the church, a calling that ended in 1970, was summoned from Salt Lake to give her blessing, where he promised her, "I say unto thee, be of good faith and of good cheer, for the Lord has heard thy petition. Thou shalt have joy in thine offspring, who shall grow up around thee and bless thee in thine old age." This encounter with Annie with Joseph F. Smith demonstrates that the leadership of the church was aware of frontier women. It shows that in at least one instance, they sacrificed their time and resources to travel all the way out to little Tooele, Utah. I don't know how many people of us have been to Tooele, to care for the needs of the vulnerable, regardless of if they were of Anglo origins or not. President Joseph F. Smith later went on to be the first president of the church to visit Sweden. True to her blessing, Annie and her husband went on to birth 7 more children, all of whom outlived her. They reported that she was a very generous woman with a door always open, for in her words, "I never know when one of the 3 Nephites might come to my door." I don't know where that door is. Unlike Ava Carlotta, I never found an address. I don't know where she buried her 4 children during that March winter. I don't know where she celebrated the birthdays of her 7 new children and mourned her 6 deceased. Understanding the religious past of our communities increases our sense of belonging. When we know the history of our land, the history of our people, we have power to draw on for support. As American pioneer and religious missionary Mary Lyons once said, "When we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It is a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us and around us." When I first moved to Utah, I wanted to leave as soon as possible. But now I don't. Now I want to stay. I want the rich, vast history to be acknowledged, understood, and celebrated. I want to drive past Del Taco to the Orem Quickwhack and know that to my right is a sacred place of burial. We carry our ancestors in us and in the land, whether Utah natives or not. Their religious experience is ours. What Ava suffered burying her children at night because of anti-polygamy laws, and Annie facing the loss of her children alone because her husband was overseas on a mission, are our collective cultural legacies. As poet and former BYU professor Susan Elizabeth Howe once wrote, "My faith is in the faith of women planting trees." May we look for the trees and legacies of these Swedish pioneer women planted every time we traverse the I-15.
Thank you, Becca. Our final speaker today is Sarah Reed. Sarah Reed is assistant professor in the Department of History here at BYU. She teaches German, Scandinavian, and immigration history, as well as family history. Her research areas include German-American studies, Scandinavian-American studies, Mormon literature, and women writers. And Sarah will be speaking on the topic of As Many Rare Flowers as You Can Bring, Anna Widtsoe's Mormon Norwegian Immigration Letters.
Okay, thank you. You've just learned a lot about the success of Mormon missionary work in the 19th century in Scandinavia and how many converts that brought to Utah. One of these was Anna Widtsoe. She was a young widow with 2 sons living in Trondheim, running a dressmaking business with the help of her younger sister, Petrolina, or she went by Lena. There in Trondheim, she was introduced to the LDS church through some neighbors who had joined, and this is kind of a famous kind of ensign story of a cobbler who left pamphlets about tracts about the LDS church and the shoes, and she got curious about it. These neighbors then got her in touch with the missionaries, and she was converted and baptized in 1881. At this time, of course, the saints were encouraged to gather to Zion and, like we've been talking about, immigrate to Utah. And she did immigrate with her 2 young sons to Logan in 1883. There she lived in a Norwegian community and with other Norwegian converts. Her sister Lena was also baptized into the church in 1883 and then immigrated to Salt Lake in 1885. The sisters' move was a bigger part of a bigger migration of Norwegians to the U.S. So from the beginnings of Norwegian immigration in 1825 to the immigration restrictions in 1924, nearly 1 million Norwegians made a new home in the U.S., and there's a graph kind of giving you a sense of the numbers over time. This is a small number in the U.S., but a huge number in Norway. So about a quarter of the population left Norway in the 19th century, which is second only to Ireland in terms of the actual percentage of immigrants leaving that country. And as Julie showed in that in the map, most of the Norwegians settled in the upper Midwest and the Dakotas, with pockets in the Pacific Northwest and, of course, a Texas colony. Compared to Denmark and Sweden, Norway sent many fewer converts. To give you kind of a sense of the numbers, the Danes obviously predominate, followed by the Swedes and then the Norwegians. Nonetheless, there was a substantial Norwegian community in the Intermountain West, and Anna and Lena were prominent members of that. We are very lucky that Anna's extensive correspondence is a part of the Widtsoe family papers that have been donated to the Church History Library. Anna was the mother of John A. Widtsoe, who became a prominent member in higher education in Utah, teaching at this college, Utah State, the University of Utah, president of Utah State and University of Utah, and then, of course, an apostle, which is why people are sort of interested in them. I would love to tell you more about how I came to know about these letters, but I don't have time, and if you have questions about that, I can answer that later. But as I was reading through her letters, I was struck at how similar they were to other Norwegian immigration letters, and how much she documented the immigration process as she maintained ties with Norwegians in the US and in Norway. When it comes to these letters, there's a term in Norwegian for them, Amerikabrev, because they're a very predominant part of the scholarship around Norwegian immigration. And Norwegian-American scholars really have an embarrassment of riches as to what's actually available. There have been many print collections in several volumes of letters of Norwegian immigrants. And many of them share common themes that I saw also in Anna's letters. So daily life, health, sickness, birth and death, hopes for the future, what it's like to be assimilating into America. Scholar Solveig Semple has written about these, that what they can offer us. Personal letters present an individual and subjective view of historical events, or ignore the larger picture completely to focus on the minutiae of daily life. The historian uses letters together with other sources of information to interpret events and synthesize individual experiences into a broader collective portrayal of the story of immigration. These letter collections are quite extensive in the Midwest, but ignore other areas, including Utah. But Anna's letters do exactly what these other ones do. They give us this personal view of a woman's conversion to Mormonism and subsequent immigration to Utah. And this personal view can add complexity to the standard narrative we have about Norwegian Mormon immigrants. For many years, scholars have supposed that Mormon Scandinavian immigrant populations gave up all their ethnic and national identities in favor of this religious identity. And a quote from William Wilson, scholar William Wilson, really sums this up. The Scandinavians did not become Yankees or English, they became Mormons, which is what the Yankees and English also became. Elsewhere in the United States, immigrants from Europe brought with them their native church, and the church helped them keep ties with the old world and retain their ethnic identity in the new one. Just the opposite was true in Utah, where pioneer settlers labored to establish a new Zion in which people would put aside ethnic and national differences to become a member in a community of saints. And to some degree, this version of immigrant assimilation into the church is the standard that the church as an institution tells as well. And I was hoping Becca was going to mention the Swedish uprising. And the Swedes wanted their own language meetings, and they didn't want to have it in Danish, and the church was like, no, you can't do that, and excommunicated some people who wanted that, and then gave them that anyway a few years later. Mormons, of course, were having their own assimilation problem at this time, right, as they're giving up polygamy and their unique economic and political systems. So there's a lot of trying to become American going on. Despite this sort of prominent view, other scholars like Julie, Jennifer Atterbury, Lynn Henriksen, Elizabeth Peterson have challenged this conventional narrative to show that it was a much more complex process of immigration and assimilation, and that there was a lasting set of affiliations for Scandinavians in the Mormon culture region beyond just their religious identity. And this work has helped bridge the gap between Scandinavian-American standard narratives and Mormon studies, which have both acknowledged the Mormon migration to Scandinavia, but has tended not to integrate it into their work. Looking at Anna Widtsoe's immigrant letters gives us another point of inflection as we study the social history, including her time of immigration, the geography, class, family status, gender, sexuality, all of those et ceteras, and in particular in this place, religion. Her letters between her conversion in Norway through her move to Utah and then her sister Lena's subsequent immigration demonstrate this through their similarity to other Norwegian immigrant letters in the Mormon context. So these letters really show her place in these overlapping circles of belonging in Norway and America. Most prominent in the collections from the letters that when she was still in Norway are from other Norwegians living in Utah, either these returned missionaries or recent immigrants that she had known in Trondheim. Her most frequent correspondent was the missionary who baptized her, Anton Skanke. In the United States, he goes by Skanky, for unknown reasons. Skanke was a native of Trondheim who had joined the church in 1861, served a mission before immigrating, and then in 1868, and then returned to Norway in 1879, which is when he became acquainted with Anna. And he continued that acquaintance through a correspondence after he returned up to Logan. His letters from Logan are filled with news of his family, of other Norwegians there that she knows, and always inquiries about their mutual acquaintances in Norway. He's the one who raises the money to help her immigrate. Even though it took a couple years longer than she wanted, he was able to finally get the full amount for her. We learned from these letters, however, that it isn't just Norwegian Mormons she kept up with. She also was corresponding with her deceased husband's colleagues, who are still Lutherans, and that before she left Norway, she went on a farewell tour to say goodbye to her family and friends. In a letter to her sister describing this trip, she talks about visiting with Hans, a former suitor of hers. She says that he loves her as much as ever, but is still too heavily under the influence of his mother and sisters. She's committed to gathering to Zion, but will continue to pray for him and will also continue to write to him. He gives her 20 kroner for her trip, which as far as I can tell is about $120 today. She describes her journey to the U.S. in her letters to Lena. She sails from Oslo to Hull in England, takes the train across England to Liverpool, catches a boat to New York before taking the train to Utah. And this is the standard way Norwegians immigrate to Utah at this time, or to the United States at this time, is through England that way. In Utah, she stays with Skanke before he helped her move into a small house and to get her furniture. She tells Lena that she decided not to marry him because she didn't love him. She doesn't mention the fact that he already had 2 wives as a possible factor in her decision. Her subsequent letters to Lena back in Norway talk about how she and her sons are trying to get set up in their new life. Anna starts a dressmaking business and eventually is able to move closer to downtown Logan to be nearer to her customers. She encourages Lena to try to start to learn English before she immigrates because she's having a hard time understanding it, but hopes that after 2 years in the country she'll be able to speak better. She talks about the different Christmas traditions they have and even talks about how some of the Norwegians have adopted these Christmas traditions. But she's glad she's come to Logan when she has, after the original settlement, because the town has been built up, including irrigation water running down the streets and mature trees. She also praises her ward, and this was an English language ward, who she says take care of the widow's orphans. She has high hopes for her boys and is certain that they'll have the freedom to succeed in America. When Lena prepares to come to the U.S., Anna's letters are filled with concerns about their material needs. She carefully instructs Lena as to exactly what fabrics and materials and from which stores to bring with her. She encourages her to bring her own sewing machine rather than selling it and buying a new one in Utah. She assures Lena that she'll be a successful seamstress in Utah because there isn't much competition. Anna has bought tickets for Lena's travel, but includes some cash in the letter to help wrap things up. If Lena doesn't need all of it, Anna has one request. After nearly 2 years in the high desert of the Rocky Mountains, she would like some flowers from her native land, including 2 myrtles with strong roots, several bulbs of Mrs. Ryan's white lilies, as many bulbs as possible as Jacob's lilies, and, as she says, as many rare flowers as you can bring. She instructs Lena to put them in a tight cigar box with good soil and water them on the way, and she assures her it can't be any more trouble than it was to bring her sons John and Osborne across on the journey. She finishes her letter with a testimony of the LDS Church because she knows Lena will be visiting with their friends and family before she immigrates and will share her letter. And I can't go into this, but later the 2 sisters there on the left go back to Norway on a mission in the early 1900s, and so they become part of the first sister missionaries and get to go back and maintain these ties with those friends. And this is the letter, this is the last letter that she sends to Lena when Lena's in Norway. And as you can see, it's well worn. It got passed around a lot. This is the scan where it would have been folded. So on the right is the first page and on the left is the last. So she includes her testimony there and mentions all the freedoms she enjoys, including the freedom to travel back to Norway, she says someday, to visit with her sons. Anna's deep religious conviction is complemented by her sense of Norwegianness. Her ethnic identity enhances, rather competes with her religious identity. Like the many flowers, Lena hopes will make her home in the high deserts of Utah a little bit more like Norway. Her letters reveal similar hopes and challenges as other Norwegian Americans in building community, to starting a new economic and material life, to balancing the forces of assimilation with hope for the future. As such, they reveal the complex negotiation of these ethnic, national, and religious identities, as well as the material and economic realities for two single women in the American West. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reed. We'd like to invite our presenters up to the table for a discussion. The way that we'll do this today is we would invite you, if you have a question, to just raise your hand, and we have a traveling microphone that will come and find you. If you are in the lobby or watching outside, if you do have a question you'd like to ask our panelists, please come to the door and we can also give you the microphone there. We will collect some questions. And I'm going to invite our presenters to reflect and take some notes. And once we have a number of questions, we will ask you to take turns in responding to the questions that you feel are most appropriate. So we'll open it up for questions. If you do have a question, please stand and tell us your name. If you're a student at BYU, please tell us what you're studying. And if you are in the community or a member of the staff or faculty at BYU, please tell us your role at BYU.
Hi, I'm Grace Gibson. I'm also majoring in history with a minor in women's studies, and I had a question for Sarah Clement Reed. You said that you found letters. I'm actually researching an ancestor of mine who converted in Norway and came to America, and I would love to know how you found those.
That's a great question. So are you guys familiar with the Saint volumes of history? So the first, the story I've been told about it is the first draft of that was very institutional heavy, very American heavy, not a lot of women or immigrants, and they decided they're going to totally redo those volumes. And they discovered in John Widtsoe's family papers that they had all this stuff from his mother, but they couldn't read it. And a friend of mine up there knew I was going to be teaching a class on Scandinavian handwriting and said, "Can you look at these and tell us if there's anything in there?" And I looked at them, and there was a lot of fabulous stuff in them. Some of the stuff I cared a lot more about than they cared about, right? Kind of a devotional history. But that's how I found those letters. So unfortunately, it's because her son was famous, right? So she's attached to a famous man. But it's still worth looking. There are collections of these places, talking to people in your family to see if there's any family history things available, and checking all sorts of archives where people may have donated them.
Okay. Additionally, just to that, I would add, first, all of my sources have just come from Family Search, which we can all access with a church count. And then also, the Daughters of the Utah Pioneer is incredible, and they have huge, collections, of letters and stories. And so that's another really good place to look. It won't help you specifically with your Norwegian, but it could help provide context for the places, the things that were going on around, if you know the cities where people settled in.
If I can just comment really quickly, Grace, you should join our team. We are exactly trying to do that, trying to help find these collections that are in people's attics and basements and memory books, and bring them together so people can find, if not their own ancestor stories, at least related stories, to get a sense of what their experiences were like. Because a lot of women didn't either write letters, or those letters weren't kept, they weren't brought back to the United States. But chances are there's some family history, some history, there's a lot of stories around there. And they also intersect in their neighbors' stories. You'll find a lot of references to people that you might be interested in.
Thank you. We'll collect a few more questions before our panelists speak.
My name is Clayton. I study anthropology here. This question is specifically for Becca because you mentioned the importance of land and place for the people you study, but for the whole panel. I was wondering if you had any insights from your research, the broader research that you're doing, about the role that the settler people that you're studying played in the genocide of indigenous peoples, and if you could speak to that a little bit and how you're addressing that.
Mm-hmm. That is a really good question.
Becca, before you start, let's just collect some questions, if it's okay.
I'll remember it.
All right.
My name is Katie, and I'm studying applied math. And I was wondering if any of you have any experiences when learning about these women and their stories helped you personally or in your personal lives.
My name is Chip Oscarson. I'm in Scandinavian Studies. I'm wondering if you could make some comparisons insofar that you're familiar with how the experience of the Scandinavian women were similar to other non-English speaking immigrants at the same time, Germans and French and others who smaller, but what are the similarities and differences?
Thank you for your questions.
Go ahead, Becca.
Okay, so I know there were a lot of Swedes involved in the Black Hawk War, and I haven't researched that specifically, but one of the women that I have been focusing on, Hilda Eriksson, she was a very prominent woman. She was dubbed the last Utah pioneer because she was the last person alive who crossed the plains.
In Grantsville, right?
In Grantsville, where the women I'm studying lived. And she was super involved in the missionary efforts to the Indian people at the time, so helping them learn how to farm. And so I have been interested in the social dynamics of that, right? Because white saviorism, them going in and teaching them how to farm, and they probably didn't really want that. But that is a really good question. I will look more into that as I continue my research.
Yeah, Julie, do you know anything about the Scandinavian involvement? Is it the Sand Pete massacre, or?
I mean, there are a lot of Scandinavians involved in these conflicts, and so various people have to move out of their homes into forts, and then back out of the fort when things calm down. They end up moving entire communities because of these conflicts. Their perspective is pretty much that they're just trying to survive. They don't really have a lot of empathy for the people that they're displacing, partly because they have displaced themselves and also really need that access. But the comparison to other Scandinavian-American communities is really helpful, I think, if you look at especially the Dakotas and the Dakota Wars and how those immigrants did often actually have some compassion and recognizing that, yes, they were both trying to survive, but that many of them had been displaced from their homes because of poverty and need, and so that there's more awareness there. So it's not easy to look at it entirely through our lens today because the conditions of what they were experiencing and the parameters of their understanding were so different. But I do find it interesting that there are moments, especially of compassion, reaching out, adopting children, trying to make harmony in their communities, despite the fact that they're coming to stay and settle this land. I can just say maybe to Chip's question that we haven't done enough. I mean, we chose Scandinavians partly because it's what we do, but also because they're such a large group, and so there is enough theoretically enough information to make some conclusions about it. I mean, there are a lot of anecdotal claims about Scandinavian women drinking coffee and pretty much everyone we've read drank coffee. But the question is, was it just Scandinavian women, or did all the women drink coffee? And so also about like polygamy, there's some sense that Scandinavian women were opposed to polygamy. The story of Sandy Peterson Lund is a famous one of where she says, you know, she'll marry him if he promises never to take another wife and lets her drink coffee. But it turns out that her letters are not quite that straightforward, that she's actually prepared her whole life to become a plural wife. She's dreading it, but she's prepared for it and never does. Also, Minnie Jorgensen, in one of her first letters to her husband when he gets to Denmark, she says, just be aware that women over there cling to a man from Zion like vines to an apple tree. Don't forget you have a wife and 5 children back home. And there's a lot of tension in her letters, like, I hear you're courting so-and-so, or so-and-so has sent money to bring a wife home. And so there's definitely a lot of tension with the principle that they are both prepared to live it, but also dreading living it. And so trying to understand what truth there is in the anecdotes is part of that. And I think once we have a baseline, it would be easier to make comparisons to say, okay, so this is what German women experienced, or French women, or British women had a different experience, again, without the language barrier. So there's lots of work to do.
Yeah, I think the standard story is everyone assimilated, but actually when you get in there, they're all kind of keeping their things, right?
Yeah, as we all do, right? Right. There was a question in the middle.
Yeah, that was about personal. I have something to share about that. So for the Saints volumes, I translated things from Anna Widtsoe's letters for that. And Saints Volume 2 ends with her description of going to the Salt Lake Temple dedication. And shortly after I did that, I went through Salt Lake for the first time to try to do it before who knows what's going on in there now, right? But I wanted to see that, and I found that really moving to be there and see what she had been describing at the first time, having gone there, so.
Mm-hmm. And like Julie was saying, we've been going through the census records for a span of,
a year now?
and 70 years of census records. And so I have touched my finger to thousands of these women. And so while I can't think of like a specific time their stories have helped me, their lives have just become such a big part of who I am. Like there's one woman, their name's all blur, but she was traveling to the endowment house to get sealed to her husband, and they were from Tooele, and so it was like a 2-day journey, and so they camped on the side of the road, and it started raining, and they didn't know how tense, this was 1880, and so she was just like sleeping under the rain with this man that she was going to marry. And so just the struggles that they experience, the hardships that they go through. When I'm struggling to write a Kennedy Center presentation, I'm like, well, 4 of my children didn't die in March. And so it's just helped change my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. Reading Minnie Jorgensen's letters has made me appreciate how hard it has always been, right? Nobody ever had it easy. But not necessarily for the reasons we think. I mean, obviously losing your children and crossing thousands of miles, those things are hard and recognizably hard. But like Minnie Jorgensen, when her husband is called on a mission and she's left to farm, she writes in this letter where she's like, it's hot and I'm fat and I've never had to farm before. I'm like, I can totally relate to all these things. And just recognizing how real these people were, that they were people who had great faith, but they also struggled to maintain that faith. And so when I have things that challenge my faith, I can look and say, look, I don't have to have the perfect record of unblemished faith. That's not how faith works. Faith works because it's tried, and you keep going anyway. And so watching these women pick themselves up again, lose 6 children and have 7 more, I'm glad that's not the burden I've been asked to carry. But I feel like recognizing how much we have in common with them has given me strength.
Are there any further questions? Please join me in a big round of applause for our presenters today.